Chapter 17. Yet more helpful friends. In conducting his monumental Bible project, Cyrus Scofield spent a good deal of time leaning on the everlasting arms of his friends, theological allies, acquaintances, and sometimes persons he had never met. The signal figures were the funders, who were not publicly acknowledged, probably by their own preference, Arno Gaebelein, several advisors whom Scofield named in the volume, 3 worker women whom Scofield did not mention, a long list of early foundational proto-dispensationalists whom Scofield was justified in not specifying. His volume was to be a practical tool, not a treatise, and perhaps other sources of help that he might well have specified. As to the funders, mostly Plymouth Brethren, the total amount of their financial contribution is unknown. Certainly they paid for what can be termed development costs and travel. I cannot find directly whether, as was indicated in discussion of the unsuccessful Gospel House contract, they ultimately paid towards composition, printing, and advertising. But undeniably, no Brethren funding, no Scofield Bible. Near the end of the process, some funding was elicited from Lyman Stewart, who 2 years later was famously to become, along with his brother Milton, the chief source of money for the fundamentals. Stewart, in Scofield's case, paid for the cost of the 3 Conferences of Christian Scholars to review Scofield's work while it was being set in type. That the funders, mostly Brethren, did not receive serious public recognition until Arno Gaebelein's memoir of 1930, and especially that of 1943, is understandable. Brethren usually heeded Jesus' directive not to make a public show of private virtue. Moreover, as we have documented earlier, from the viewpoint of the established evangelical denominations, the Brethren often were seen as toxic. To have a version of the Scriptures that critics easily could denounce as Brethren in origin would have been fatal to its widespread acceptance. The same explanation does not cover the 3 quiet women workers on the SRB. Mind you, they were women, which within the context of their era was reason enough for their erasure. Besides, they were down the status scale as far as letters after their name was concerned. No honorary doctors of divinity. One of these was Scofield's wife, Hetty. When the couple was on their first European journey, perhaps in 1904 to 1905, intending to give undivided attention to the work that lasted for 11 months, 9 of which were spent in solid work at Montreux, Switzerland, Cyrus fell desperately ill. It was one of the several attacks that Satan began making upon him, and this work of putting the riches of God's Word freely at the disposal of multitudes who otherwise would not have them. Hetty stepped in, and while Cyrus was completely incapacitated for 3 or 4 months, and unknown to him, she pasted entire Bibles on big blank books, boards essentially, that allowed for large margins, giving room to do editorial work by hand. This was but the beginning of the large contributions made by his devoted wife to the monumental work that lay ahead for both of them. That Hetty was nowhere credited publicly for this and other work is not unusual. Preachers' wives were expected to be invisible workers. Hetty is also mentioned in Trumbull's biography as joining her husband during one of his stays at the Clifton Springs Sanitarium. Most likely, this was in the winter of 1906 to 1907. On this visit, Scofield was there not so much as an invalid as because of the splendid facilities there for the best food and air, and medical attention when needed, as at the same time freedom to go on with his work. They brought along Miss Ella E. Pola, Scofield's longtime secretary at the Bible correspondence course, which he still was running as a profit center, soon to be sold to the Moody Bible Institute. Mrs. Scofield and Miss Pola put together the chain references, that now were inserted into the draft page boards. One wants to know more about Miss Pola. In the later stages, she camped with the Scofields on their site on the Connecticut River while working on the book. A third woman, Miss Emily Farmer, is even more elusive, and well may have been a significant contributor both in content and technical book production. She is not mentioned in Trumbull's biography, but crucially appears in independent third-party sources. She was a professional in publishing and deeply knowledgeable in Brethren theology. The Scofields had moved to an apartment in New York City in early 1908, there to work on the final proofing of the manuscript and the proofreading, functions that overlapped in a high-pressure run to the finish line. They needed help. Scofield contacted the Brethren publisher Loiseau, who, it will be recalled, in 1888 had published the first professional edition of Scofield's Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, the initial step leading to the Scofield Reference Bible. They had in their employ a deeply knowledgeable young Brethren woman, Emily Farmer, whom they had brought over from Colchester, England in 1907 to do editorial work. She proved competent, certainly, spending 40 years with the firm. So in November 1908, one suspects earlier, she was seconded to Scofield, and she joined Cyrus and Hetty in completing the notes. I was strictly limited to the checking of references for 2 days, she remembered. Then, everything I saw. Scofield, in Miss Farmer's memory, was an amiable boss. She had a note from him saying, "I beg to request you will freely indicate to me anything in the editorial comment which you think contrary to the truth of God," and he either agreed and changed things, or declined and said why. Having a smart young saint as a proofreader, fact-checker, and rewrite editor can only have been a godsend. Miss Farmer remembered one especially telling physical detail. In the final push, 2 sets of reference books were on Scofield's desk, John Nelson Darby's Synopsis of the Books of the Bible and F.W. Grant's Numerical Bible. In contrast to his not giving public recognition of the worker bees, Scofield overpraised famous men, or if not famous, at least recognizable and useful identities in evangelical circles. On the title page of his Bible, more as advertising than genuine acknowledgement, were the names and position of 7 men. These consulting editors had been convened 3 times. First in August 1908 at Grove City College, a small conservative religious school north of Pittsburgh, the second at the same place in late August, and the third at Princeton University in September. These events were paid for by Lyman Stewart. Your kind and generous gift will, I am sure, cover the expense of all this, including some modest compensations to the brethren. The events were small private discussions. At the first one, the participants were only Scofield, W. G. Moorhead of United Presbyterian Theological Seminary, W. J. Erdman, who had served as secretary of the Niagara Conference, and his son Charles, a Princeton theology professor. Ernest Sandine came to the conclusion that apparently Scofield only meant to gain support for his publication from both sides of the millenarian movement with this device. He might have added that this was also a useful way of nobbling men who were potential critics from within the conservative evangelical camp. Granted, Scofield possibly had a correspondence with each of these individuals. He had a printed version of his prospectus available in 1906, but if so, it has left little trace. The real matter is that members of this group met with Scofield very late in the day, after the separate pieces of the manuscript were in complete draft and the printed proofs were coming in. They might have changed a word or two, but nothing major. As credited on the title page as consulting editors were Arno C. Gabeline, who was here being disrespected as he justifiably saw himself as associate editor, William J. Erdman and W. G. Moorhead. As mentioned in Chapter 13, these two ranking scholars on the list already had abandoned Scofield's premillennialism and were no longer necessarily even dispensationalists, along with Henry G. Weston, president of Crozier Theological Seminary and an established evangelical scholar; Arthur T. Pearson, freelance, foreign mission enthusiast, former Presbyterian minister who had served as a locum at Spurgeon's Tabernacle; James M. Gray, president of Moody Bible Institute, no scholar; and Elmore Harris, president of the Toronto Bible Training School and an energetic anti-liberal. Such were the men whose helpful fame was desired, whose actual help less so. Equally blurred is how, if at all, Scofield was informed by the work of foreign scholars, particularly British professors. Trumbull, relaying claims by Scofield, has Cyrus and Hetty spending 2 years in Oxford. That is patently impossible, given their other activities. Yet, here the treasures of the Oxford libraries were fully at the disposal of the man who was making himself a Bible scholar by mastering the Bible scholarship of the world. He covered the whole field of such scholarship, whether friendly or unfriendly to the Bible. Scofield was not high-table material, and in late life, when interviewed by a Dallas friend who several times asked about Scofield's Oxford academic interchanges, was told little would he ever say, and always was anxious to turn the conversation into other channels. In truth, one cannot see that Scofield met with any university figures of significance. The few religious scholars he dealt with were angular bods, the sort of brilliant outliers who were willing to give attention to anyone who paid attention to them. In the introduction to the Scofield Reference Bible, Scofield singles out 2 English scholars, Professors Sayce and Margoliouth of Oxford. The former, the Reverend Archibald H. Sayce, 1845 to 1933, was at the time Scofield met him the holder of a personal chair as professor of Assyriology. Sayce in the 1880s had done pioneering work on monumental inscriptions, notably those at Siloam. In his side field, biblical studies, he had been one of Oxford University's representatives on the committee that produced the revised version of the Old Testament. He was one of the founders of the Society of Biblical Archaeology and wrote against the higher criticism of the Bible. His printed lectures read smoothly to this day, and one suspects that Scofield knew these well, but not the man himself. At the time, Sayce, in poor health, lived winters on his houseboat on the Nile, and for the rest of the year his principal residence was in Edinburgh. Scofield's second Oxford face, David Samuel Margoliouth, 1858 to 1940, was an equally elliptical figure within the university community. The son of East End London Jews, his father had converted to Christianity and become an Anglican proselytizer of English Jews. David had a good education, scholarship at Winchester, and then New College, Oxford, with subsequent prizes. In a contested election, he was awarded the Laudian Chair of Arabic in 1890, and from thence combined ghost-like reticence within the university with an impressive run of work on early Arabic literature topics and a facility to instruct in Syriac and Ethiopic. Curiously, he was priested in 1899, and for a time was the examining chaplain for the Church of England Bishop of Liverpool. Margoliouth combined a commitment to evangelical Anglicanism with a reputation within his own specialty for increasing intellectual strangeness. That was it. Sayce and Margoliouth were Scofield's Oxford Common Room. In reality, the only Oxford community that Scofield remembered with clarity and warmth was a Brethren assembly. In his words, this was a little group of worthy middle-class Englishmen of the sect, they would warmly deny being a sect of the so-called open brethren. When Hetty Scofield learned of a family problem in America, both she and her husband found spiritual fellowship and comfort in a little gathering of Plymouth brethren with whom they had worshipped while in Oxford, and their Christian friends there interceded earnestly in their behalf. As for intellectual interchange, the one reference in the introduction that rings true is to Mr. Walter Scott, the eminent Bible teacher, who actually did not live in Oxford. As we have mentioned in chapters 14 and 15, Scott had been an active exclusive intervener in the 1890s in the North American Brethren's fissure, and he and Scofield had probably encountered each other then, and certainly later at the Seacliff conferences. With Walter Scott, Scofield shared a language. Without being too rigid about it, we might formulate a simple, almost arithmetical description of the relationship of Cyrus Scofield and his helpers. Those who manifestly participated in the coalface work were either invisible, the three women, or downgraded. Gabeline, who had produced the spine of the prophetic interpretations, was only author, harmony of prophetic word, etc., etc. And Walter Scott, who had a genuine commonality of scholarship with Scofield, were relegated to the small print in the introduction. In contrast, those who had done nothing, the Oxford professors, or were useful as hitching posts, the 7 consulting editors, were over-recognized. Simple metric. It hints that it might be well to consider other contributors who were not mentioned in dispatches. And that brings back to mind the Reverend Dr. Frank Charles Thompson, D.D., Ph.D., distinguished American Methodist minister. Henry Froude, one recalls, had entered into an arrangement to publish a co-edition of Thompson's Marginal Chain Reference Bible in the United Kingdom before he had agreed with Scofield to publish his work. At least that is what he told Scofield. Then he tried to drop Thompson's volume, and when Thompson shrewdly kept Froude to the co-publication arrangement, Froude grudgingly continued with Thompson's volume as his own publication, but he invested in a full OUP edition of Scofield's work to be published on both sides of the Atlantic. Thompson, not unnaturally, was concerned with the same thing Scofield had been. Who had arrived first at the OUP negotiating table? And delicate matter this, had there been any lifting from his own work into Scofield's work, which among its many other features was being talked about as having a marvelous new system of scriptural chain references. The logic box here is simple. Either one of the two men may have unethically borrowed from the other, or neither had done so, or both had. When Thompson raised these matters in a letter, Froude let the question sit for a fortnight, and then replied, "In reply to your inquiry, I do not think the Scofield Bible is identical with yours, and it appears to me to cover somewhat different ground." Accurate enough, but the issue for Thompson was the chain method, not the whole Scofield biblical production. Froude, now firmly committed to the entire Scofield project, added an implication of Scofield's priority. "I understand that Dr. Scofield's scheme was fully discussed in American newspapers a few years ago, when the chain method was explained." This suggested, without quite saying so, that any overlap was Thompson's fault. But I cannot put my hand on any printed account of the system. Thus, in a revealing moment, Froude forgave his own possible sins. If there was a chance that Scofield had taken chain references from Thompson, that was no responsibility of publisher Froude, or even of Scofield, since some unspecified American newspapers had earlier written about Scofield's work. Froude had no capacity to produce any such evidence, probatively irrelevant though it would have been. He had to close the matter, and he did so in a terminally bullying fashion. I must refer you, therefore, to our Mr. Armstrong of New York, who has the matter in hand, for any further information he may feel at liberty to give you. This interchange might be set aside as merely one of the slightly noxious swirls that are part of many author-publisher situations, except that they indicate that Thompson had hit a nerve. Aside from again illustrating that Froude could be a hard man, it points to something gelatinous, something not stable in the whole run-in to the appearance in early 1909 of the Scofield Reference Bible. And here the indeterminacy is not just the untraceable and contradictory nature of Scofield's travel and fictive UK-European scholarly studies, but also of Froude's nimble ambidexterity in manipulating things, neither hand being fully shown, and Froude's own motives being a secret known only to his maker. Had these matters not concerned the content and form of a text that multiple millions have held sacred, no one would have cared. But this was biblical in scale. It was not just about a reference Bible, but actually an assertive new set of scriptures. From mid-1907 onwards, Henry Froude was the dominant player in the final entry into the American spiritual economy of two major works, Thompson's and Scofield's, each of which promised marked influence on Protestant biblical beliefs. Happily, we have the historical luxury of looking at a few visual exhibits that indicate the practical options Froude had as a publisher and show how he navigated. Froude, arguably the English-speaking world's most influential figure in real ink and paper production of the Jewish Christian scriptures, had an enormous range of ways to present the King James Version, and in so doing, to influence the way that it was read. In 1876, when he was still simply manager of the Bible Warehouser, Oxford had 40 different editions of the KJV in print. And when Froude became publisher and had his beloved India paper to play with, dozens more appeared, including all sorts of trick editions of unusual size, and for the tiniest, only feathers of weight. Here, though, in the case of two transatlantic exercises that promised to be adventurous in terms of content, he used his most austere palette. As an example that indicates the stripped-down version of the sort I am suggesting, not proving, suggesting, that Froude began with as he approached both Thompson and Scofield. This is a transatlantic configuration from the later 1890s. The spelling and punctuation are those of the modernized version of 1769. Notice what is not here. No apocrypha, no marginal notes marking variant renderings, no internal divisions within biblical books. Chapters and verses are identified numerically, and at the start of each chapter, italic print pointers list key verses. Tag running heads, descriptive, not doctrinal in nature, sit on the top of each page. The text is presented in two simple columns, no distractions. The title page counts, for it was a territorial claim by Froude at the time his New York branch was just coming into form. He used only the street address in New York as identification. If we take this exhibit as an empirical instantiation of Froude's mindset when he was focused on the bare essentials of transatlantic Bible production, and if we grant that the exhibit involves both the presentation of a sacred text and a calling card in the international publishing industry, then we have a sensible indication of the foundation Froude used when building his later, more elaborate UK American editions. From this base, he took some very big leaps. The second exhibit, figure 17.2a, 17.2b, and 17.2c, shown in the print and ebook formats of this book, like the previous one, is both a religious and an industrial document. It is the title page of the marginal chain reference Bible that Froude had bought into before he had seen Scofield's plan. Reluctantly, he published it in mid-1908. In his preface, dated the 28th of April, 1908, the Reverend Mr. Thompson said that he had been at work on it for 15 years. Crucially, note that it is a joint publication with the New York publisher Eaton and Mains, and that Froude, in publishing the work in the British Isles, did so without any identification with Oxford. Was he investing his own money? And if so, was he using the office and distributional facilities of the Bible Warehouse, now the London business, to sell and distribute the item? It is slightly counterintuitive, but this title page summarizes a business arrangement very similar to what Froude, Scofield, and the awkward Mr. Bass of the Gospel Publishing House in New York were, unsuccessfully, contemplating in the spring of 1907. A transatlantic co-publication of Scofield's work, printed in the United States, at least for the American edition, thus protecting copyright, and sold by a minor league American publisher, together with a British Isles edition that would have some manner of English publication that involved the name of Henry Froude, but not necessarily that of Oxford. Cyrus Scofield, in another of his pieces of good fortune, escaped that backwater. To review here Thompson's Chain Reference Bible in some detail would be intriguing. It can be conceived as the alternate Scofield Bible, which almost was the case. In doing so, it would illuminate a number of character issues relating to the final Scofield-Froude publication of 1909. But in the present frame of discussion, there are two central points. First, that Thompson's system of chain reference was significantly superior to Scofield's, and second, that this did not matter to Froude. To compress brutally, a full comparative examination on a broad canvas would indicate that while Scofield's system was certainly serviceable, Thompson's was brilliant. Both of the systems were aimed at helping pastors and laypersons who did not have access to a library, overwhelmingly the situation among evangelical students of the Scriptures, in order to trace through the Bible, mention by mention, the big themes and symbols in the text. Scofield's marginal references were tailored to fit into a center column that on each page would divide two stacks of biblical texts. Thompson also arranged his references to fit with two banks of text. Obviously, unless one used some very eccentric layouts, Thompson had room for more entries and for more words to explain the individual entries than did Scofield. More important, Thompson's work was a quantum level above Scofield's in, to use an anachronistic term, functionality. Both Scofield and Thompson winkled out skeins of theme words, concepts, and images in the Bible, running from half a dozen references to 24. The question in each case was how to access any given chain. In each, one could 1. Encounter a theme in some Bible verse and follow it, reference by reference, sequentially, and 2. At every link in the chain, each author always included a reference to the first link in the sequence, so that the reader could trace its full development from beginning to end. That is where Scofield's usefulness ended. Thompson added an ancillary feature that was slightly random but valuable, namely 3, that when some concept came up that was close to a specific chain but not quite a fit, a marginal note pointed to that fact. 4. Crucially, and most helpful for functionality, Thompson in his end matter provided an alphabetic subject index that included every reference in every chain. Hence, it was possible to enter every chain at any point and to read the sequences forward or backwards, or any other way one wished. Scofield provided only a summary at the point of last entry, and these were highly theologized. Scofield compiled, or had compiled for him, an alphabetic subject index, but it did not mesh with his marginal notes. The full ingenuity and serviceability of the Thompson system, as well as the tremendous amount of intellectual labor involved in its creation was deftly recognized by a study in DHQ, Digital Humanities Quarterly, that indicated that in many ways it anticipated the hyperlink and the graphical interface, foundational and familiar elements of the World Wide Web. Its ability to provide theme-based linkages between biblical texts was unrivaled, and in 2012, when this study was done, the printed, hard copy version of Thomson's chain system provided more hyperlinking capability than was available electronically. Simple situation. Henry Froude had two systems of biblical chain references in hand, one markedly superior to the other, as an elementary use test would indicate. Froude chose the lesser of the two. From our distance, it is easy to suggest that he may have been niggled by some liberal details in the Thomson chain references, such as Thomson's inserting dates, something Scofield borrowed in his 1917 revision of the SRB, and then marking some of the earliest ones with a question mark, such as BC 4004 ? At Genesis chapter 2. More significantly, Thomson's Bible was Methodist in doctrine. Froude was aware of this from the beginning. In contrast, when the Scofield proposal was fully presented to him, he gained access not only to a chain reference system whose every link in the chain was acceptable to his personal exclusive brethren theology, but also to a set of other tools, discussed in a moment, that turned the Scriptures into a brethren document. Froude, in his professional life as a publisher, had no problem in printing and distributing Anglican prayer books, dissenting teachers' Bibles, and some very worldly items of classical mythology. He was a professional. But the Scofield project was something else. In his correspondence, quoted previously, we observed his becoming more and more personally involved. I am greatly interested in the edition of the Bible upon which you are laboring. The material you are preparing will, I think, greatly help and encourage Bible study. I shall be quite willing to issue your Bible in this country, under my own imprint. I had undertaken to produce a Bible at my own risk for Dr. Scofield. Dr. Scofield's volume will be practically my own book. In this project, Froude invested his own spiritual commitment in a singular way. As we take visual stock of the manner that the Scofield Reference Bible reshaped the scriptural text, an obvious possibility, yet never stated, arises. Would we do well to consider that perhaps Henry Froude, like Arno Gaebelein, should be recognized as a co-creator of the SRB? In October 1908, the Scofields were living in a New York apartment, and the typesetters were already setting the New Testament. They were into the Gospel of John. The Scofields and Miss Emily Farmer, seconded to the project from the Brethren publishing firm of Loiseau, were fighting to finish editing and proofing, so that the book would be out by mid-January 1909. For copyright reasons, the book had to have final typesetting done in the United States. Joseph Canfield has the type being composed by the very upmarket firm of Theodore L. Devin and Company, and this is a reasonable suggestion. Wherever it was typeset, this was done according to design specifications worked out by Froude, the Clarendon press designers and typographers, and agreed to by Scofield. Theodore Devin was recognized a premier printer, as well as a scholar of typography and a founder of the Grolier Club, and his Manhattan firm published facsimile and high-end, short-run literary and commemorative works under its own imprint, and did commercial printing of the expensive sort. That Froude would have the New York branch of OUP engage this level of a firm certainly would have been wise from a business perspective. The Scofield Project was the first major publication to be originated in the American branch, and it needed to speak publishing excellence. Equally important, this was very much Henry Froude's own book, the closest he would ever come to publishing a vademecum of Brethren theology. In January 1909, Arno Gaebelein received one of the first copies, and we found that it was indeed a beautiful specimen of Bible printing. At the beginning of April, the Scofield Reference Bible was on sale throughout the United States.